Okay, why don't we begin? My name is Eliot Cohen. I'm the Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I want to welcome everybody to another Dean's Forum. This one's somewhat unusual. In the past few months, we've had Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, we've had Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, Arianna Huffington, and others talking about international affairs. Today, I thought we'd do something different and talk about something that is very much in need at this moment in history, particularly as people cope with what is now, in some cases, the 7th or 8th month of coronavirus, plus all the other stresses and strains that we feel. And I thought for the conversation that I would conduct, rather than going outside, I would go inside SAIS and speak to someone who actually is a real and deep expert in resilience. And that's Craig Osborne, the Chief of Staff at SAIS. Craig has been at SAIS for over a year, but before that he served 30 years in the United States Army, retiring as a colonel of infantry in 2019. He's had leadership positions from platoon through company to battalion and brigade. He served on the Joint Staff as a senior military planner. His last position was as Chief of Staff at National Defense University. But I think probably more today, he's been through a lot. He was on the first aircraft into Saudi Arabia in 1990 after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. He's been in peace enforcement missions. Above all, he has experienced 5 years in combat as an infantryman in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was awarded 5 Bronze Stars. He has been blown up 7 times by IEDs. He commanded a battalion that took 135 casualties out of about 1,000 in 2006. There's an article about that in the New York Times, which we'll put in the chat. And he's had to overcome quite a bit of adversity as a result of the injuries that he has suffered. He's got a bachelor's from Illinois State, a master's from Kansas State, as well as a whole host of degrees from American military educational institutions. And it's wonderful to have him here, not only as the terrific Chief of Staff that he is, but also as somebody who can really speak to this moment and to this challenge. So, Craig, welcome to the stage here. Let me ask you to say something first and foremost about what do you think resilience means?
Well, thank you, Dean Cohen. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think overall resilience is really the ability to bounce back from adversity. There are a lot of different definitions, and you could probably find as many definitions as there are sources, but all have a similar theme of bouncing back from some traumatic event, some stressor, or some circumstance that challenges who we are, what we believe the world to be like or should be like, and we're required to deal with it in some sort of way to overcome it. I personally think there should be an element included in any definition of adversity of growing from that challenge, of not just enduring it or living through it, but having some reflective time and understanding that it has changed you in some way. And what you can do to grow from that should be a part of resilience. A couple of other thoughts perhaps about resilience. I think it's important to understand there's not just one way to be resilient. And some of those ways require flexible adaptation. Different challenges and different circumstances can require us to modify how we respond to stresses given the circumstances that we face. There's not a one-size-fits-all to resiliency. I also think there's some element of time that there's an important view that if you undergo or experience adversity in some way, and it takes you, say, 6 years to get past that, that is someone who's not as resilient as someone who gets past that and moves on and adjusts more quickly. So there's a temporal aspect of resilience that the more quickly you can identify, overcome, get back to some sort of normalized state is really important as well. There's sometimes a false view of resilience in my mind that it is a very sequential event, that you have an event, You get through it, and then you return back to some original state. I don't actually, in my own experience, think that's true. That you can undergo adversity and you will never be exactly the same as you were before the event. You will hopefully be better, more prepared, more well adjusted, but you don't ever go back to exactly the way you were before. You're changed and modified in some way. And resilience does require us to not just think about how we can adjust after the fact, but there's an element of we need to be resilient during the event or during the trauma or during the difficult circumstance or stresses that we face.
So let me ask you, and by the way, I should explain to everybody that I thought I would conduct the conversation as I usually do for about 20, 30 minutes, and then open up the forum for questions. So don't use the chat, use the Q&A function. I'll be giving preference, of course, to students. So just, I would ask that you identify yourself. And like I said, put any questions that you have in the chat. So let me ask, first, at what point in your military career did you realize that you personally needed to develop resilience? And then maybe talk a little bit about how your thinking about resilience evolved during the course of 30 years, a lot of it spent in combat.
I think in its broadest sense, I had a very, I didn't understand resilience well for the majority of my career. If you start out as a young infantry officer, you want to be perceived as almost impervious. You want to be the toughest person there. You want to be the one that can do anything that's asked of you. And I knew I needed resilience, what I thought was resilience, to get through, say, Ranger School. At the very start of your career, Ranger School is a 2-month-long course that really tries to push you to your limits, that it tries to break you in some ways. And it's 8 weeks with very little sleep, 1 meal a day, operating in the mountains, the desert, the swamps of Florida, for example. And I thought I was being resilient by having survived it and graduated from it. Similarly, as you mentioned, I was the first aircraft into Saudi Arabia after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. For a part of that deployment, I literally lived in a hole in the ground on the Iraqi border for months. No electricity, no running water, that kind of thing. And I thought I was being resilient because I survived that and did okay. But as I kind of progressed through my career, I realized that I wasn't really resilient. I was just persevering. I was just enduring what I had to go through to do my job. And especially after that deployment you referenced in 2005 and 6, I realized that I was just, to use a boxing analogy, taking body blows. I was getting hit, but I wasn't hitting back. I wasn't doing anything to make it better, to respond in a more positive way, to impact not only my own thoughts, but how I responded to those adverse situations. So it probably took me nearly 20 years of enduring, persevering, surviving before I really accepted the fact that I could do something about this. I didn't have to just be a victim of what was happening to me, but I could actually control that to some degree. In fact, I think I got to the point of telling people that the only thing you can't control is the activating event, the trigger of what has happened. But your response to it, your beliefs, all the rest of that is under your control. And you can have some belief, you can have some skills, some experiences, some resilience to deal with that in a much better, more productive way.
So, I'm sure that there are plenty of folks who are listening to this and saying, well, okay, I'm not going to be commanding an infantry battalion in combat in Baghdad. I'm not experiencing those kinds of things. I'm experiencing a different kind of misery because I've been working at home with my kids screaming all the time, or I'm kind of stuck in a little apartment or I can't really be close to loved ones. That's a very different kind of proposition. So could you just maybe begin talking a little bit about what's the nature of the transference between resilience in a military sense from people who are bred, as you say, to persevere and to be tough, and a bunch of normal civilians who are just find themselves in a really difficult place?
Of course, a Of interest, the military's focus on resilience really started about 10 years ago, and it came out of a University of Pennsylvania civilian program on positive psychology and how to best deal with depression in the Philadelphia area. So the vast majority of what we call master resiliency skills, and I think there's 14 in the Army we subscribe to, are based off a civilian model. And I do think there are many similarities between a deployment and what we're all experiencing now with COVID-19. The military, as you alluded to, we're relatively well trained to adjust to those things. We're getting better at that as a military, but civilians aren't necessarily explicitly taught how to deal with it in a way that the military is getting to the point of being. There is clearly an unpredictability and an uncertainty of life in both environments. You could go outside the wire, so to speak, at anywhere in a previous deployment, and there's a threat there. Similarly, there's an unpredictability and uncertainty of life with now over 200,000 of our fellow country people who have passed away from the virus. There's an isolation from families. I have not seen my parents, for example, since this began, as many other people have experienced similar isolations. And there's some coping mechanisms and skills that can be employed to make that absence of connection a little bit better. Obviously, when you're deployed, you're not seeing your family either. There's something that the military has actually transferred and tried to teach some of our civilian counterparts is how best to deal with the inability to be with a loved one as they pass away. That is something that the military has had to deal with for decades and centuries, actually. That civilian populations have not had to deal with that in quite the same way. There's a very blurred line, I think, as you and I sit here, Dean Cohen, and talk to each other on Zoom every day. We are actually, some say, living at work. As we've gone from working from home to almost living at work. There's a blurred line between a professional and a personal separation. And some of the skills we use in the military on deployments, in which you're literally living in your environment 24 hours a day, sometimes apply to our situations here in the COVID environment. There's also constrained movements. There's small spaces. We can't really get out and do the things we enjoy doing. And there's obviously the PPE, the personal protective equipment issues as well. We wonder if they're adequate. There's always this nagging sensation in the back of your mind of, will this protect me enough? Is a mask enough? Or where should I be going? Or where should I not be going? So I do think there are some mindsets that are applicable to both environments. And I would even go as far to say that none of the skills and resilience that we teach in the military are in any way military specific. In fact, you could go through an entire course on resilience taught by the military and use only civilian examples to illustrate all the points.
So, one of the things, again, let me just remind everybody that if you would like to throw a question out there, please put it in the Q&A. One of the things I've heard you talk a lot about is optimism. And this is actually a discussion I find myself having with a lot of people at a time when very few people are actually feeling particularly optimistic. And maybe it's particularly appropriate that we're having this conversation after a debate last night that I don't think left many people feeling really particularly cheery about state of American democracy. What's the difference between being optimistic and just being sort of Pollyanna-ish or foolish or unrealistic? And how important is optimism? I mean, when we persevere, to use that distinction that you used before, we don't necessarily have to be optimistic while we persevere. We're just putting our head down and charging on ahead. But optimism is something different. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit on that theme.
Sure. I've gotten to the point, I think, that optimism is actually the most important part of resilience. I believe that to be true, and I think most of the research would indicate that as well. The UPenn Positive Psychology Center, there's the director there, Dr. Karen Rivich, she calls optimism the engine to resilience, almost a panacea, to use her words. And really, optimism in its most simple sense is a belief in a positive future, that things will get better. That is not the same as being Pollyannish, though. It's a clear-eyed recognition of the conditions that exist, but a disposition to believe that things will improve. that there's a better future out there. It's a future focus as opposed to sitting in misery and being pessimistic or just enduring the circumstances that you find yourselves in. Optimism is really, it's a mindset. It drives both what we think, how we perceive things, and how we think about the world moving forward. We see challenges as opportunities instead of only threats. There's a couple of different ways I think the research indicates you would assess optimism, and we can all take a test and determine whether we are more optimistic or less optimistic on a particular scale. But optimism is both dispositional, kind of how we see things, how we would answer questions such as, in uncertain times, I expect the best. That is a disposition we have as a human being. And you can be somewhere on the continuum of pessimistic to optimistic on that continuum. But there's also a past-looking version of optimism called explanatory style. It is, how do we explain the causes of things that happen to us? Do we believe that the major cause of the problem is internal versus external? Is it changeable, unchangeable, or is it global, applying to every part of your life, or just very specific? And optimism creates the conditions mentally for you to be prepared to engage in the subject matter or the circumstances for a more positive outcome. It kind of sets the environment in your mind. And it's not just a way to be more resilient, but it has both cognitive and behavioral benefits. People who are optimistic are shown to be, they have better relationships with people. They deal better with stress. They have greater qualities of life. Their immune system is stronger. They live longer. In fact, they have fewer instances of coronary artery disease. And this isn't just stuff I make up, but it's actually in the research. They follow populations that more optimistic people have better qualities of life, are healthier, and see the world as a better place.
Could you maybe make that a little bit more concrete by just giving an example from your personal experience?
Sure. The in 2006, I was blown up 6 times that year by IEDs in Western Baghdad. And when I came back, I was struggling through some mild traumatic brain injuries, is what the result of those were. I was taking a lot of, I failed to basically take charge and be optimistic that I can make this better. I, at some point, had gotten to the point of, this is my new life. My head hurts all the time. I have difficulty thinking. I have some isolation issues that kind of all fall into the MTBI, depression, anxiety realm. But when I became more optimistic, when I viewed what had happened to me as the only thing that I couldn't change, I started to get a lot better. I started to engage with people much more productively. I started to be physically more healthy. In fact, to give you just an example that probably is a bit too much information, at the time I was taking 17 pills a day for pain and things like that associated with the injuries I had. At this point, I take 1. So I have become healthier. My immune system is better. I view the world in a different way. And I just have a better, more optimistic view of the world, which allows me to be more resilient, to see things not as a threat, not as something I can't overcome, but as a starting point only.
So yeah, I can see there we're beginning to get questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to turn to them, I think, after this next question, which I think may open up a whole range of issues. One is, which is, so you've been trained in resilience. You've obviously done a lot of reading in it. You know, what do you think are some of the most important common elements or themes? And then actually, I'd be particularly interested just in some of your personal perspectives, because I'm sure that what happens is everybody evolves their own set of perspectives on this issue. You know, some you just mentioned, Wayne, one of them that you think optimism is really the key. Could you, again, what are the common elements, and what is your own particular cocktail, if you will?
Sure. I think a lot of the common elements are, one has to do with identifying the things that you can control and focus on those and disregard other things. There has to be a great deal of self-awareness to be resilient. almost to the point of you can step back and analyze things in your life, analyze the circumstances you find yourself in, and you have to have a detached perspective in some ways to be able to objectively evaluate what's happening to you. There's definitely an idea that's common to connect with others, that there's a social element to being resilient. Resilient people are not isolationists. They're not hermits. Resilient people have connections, and they cultivate them, and sometimes in an intentional way, to make sure that they have the skills, the tools to get past whatever they're facing. And you also find a lot of information about how your physical health impacts your resilience. You can't just do this mentally. This is not just a psychological exercise to be resilient. And you can't just do it socially, but there's a large component of your health and how your health contributes to and enables resilience in many ways. So after looking at a lot of things and reading a lot of books and going through some training, I kind of came down to what I remember. I identified three comments, three phrases: control your thoughts, connect with others, and take care of yourself. And to me, those are really the three big buckets of ideas or variables that I think has allowed me to be more resilient. And I think most things you find in the literature would fall into one of those three areas. So controlling your thoughts, obviously that requires self-awareness and self-regulation. Some people will say that those people who are left-brained, those are more methodical and analytical, have a leg up in this particular case than those who are right-brained and are more creative and artistic. But both can adopt these ideas. Optimism, as we talked about, is very important in controlling your thoughts. It's important to recognize that nearly all challenges we face are temporary. That there is a end point that will come that allows you to see the future in a positive way. There will be an end to this at some point. But it's also, and back to the optimistic part of not being Pollyannish, some things won't be temporary. And it's important to identify those up front and not try to change the things that you can't change. A lot of us have this belief that we have, I'll call them errors in logic, that we have thinking traps. We catastrophize things. We think everything is my fault or everything is your fault. And that really is not helpful in many different ways. We have to be able to objectively identify when we're doing that and then step back and figure out, okay, if I'm catastrophizing, take for right now, this example, this webinar here. If I'm a catastrophizing person and I wanted to worry about things in large measure, I could have said, all right, this is going to be an absolute disaster today because I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know. I'm not an expert at this. I'll embarrass myself. And we just go down the runaway train line of all the bad things that can happen as a result of being on this webinar. But there are definitely ways and skills to address those if you're in touch with yourself enough to know what your likelihood or your tendencies are. So one particular way is called evidence-based real-time resilience. In that particular case, I just said, this is going to be a disaster, is you provide evidence to yourself and have a starting sentence such as, that's not true because, and you tell yourself, that's not true because I've done this twice before this month. I'm a certified master resiliency trainer. I have some credibility with the people I'll be talking about, I think. And you can just kind of convince yourself objectively and with evidence why that's not true and reduce the impetus to catastrophize. And there's a lot of different triggers for catastrophizing. There's also helplessness. Gaining and maintaining perspective is another way that we talked about, about making sure that you can control your thoughts. That there's definitely a way to view things objectively. And probably the last two things I'll mention here is gratitude is an important element in controlling your thoughts. And we talk a lot about the negative aspects of resilience and what not to do and the things to control because they're bad. But there are proactive ways, like practicing gratitude, identifying the good things, and the military calls it hunt the good stuff. And even there's a segment on CNN every morning called The Good Stuff. And to me, that's a direct corollary to trying to get people out of the COVID doom and gloom, that there's good things happening out there. And actually intentionally trying to find those things, intentionally looking for the good things that are out there, is a way to control your thoughts. And the last part I mentioned about controlling your thoughts is you have to find a purpose. There's a lot of purposeful intention to what you're doing when you control your thoughts. There's a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor. And kind of the takeaway of that is you can endure any what or how if you know the why that you're doing it. And the why can change over time. For instance, in one of my deployments, I went over to Baghdad thinking, I'm going to go there for democracy, to free the Iraqi people, for all the good, broad reasons. After a period of time, that wasn't working for me anymore. And what really worked for me was this little girl named Sukaina. And if you put up that picture of Sukaina, that'd be terrific now. But my purpose at the time was to keep Sukaina safe. And she was the granddaughter of one of the people that I worked with, one of the sheikhs nearby. But that was my purpose. That allowed me to endure things that I otherwise may not have, because I was very focused on protecting her family, protecting her life, giving her a future wherever that may be. You go ahead and take that down now. And then after a period of time, we had too many casualties. I started to go to a purpose of getting people back home, making sure they got home. So your purpose can change and doesn't have to be set in stone, but it can morph and change over a period of time. The second aspect is connecting with others. We are social people, and we have to interact with others to be as resilient as we can be. But there's also an important aspect of connecting with the right people. If you want to start a workout regimen, you don't want to hang out with people who hate fitness. Similarly, if you want to be resilient, it's challenging to be around people who aren't resilient or who are pessimists. So you have to choose who you want to be with. And sometimes you have to reassess who you're spending your time with and how much time you spend on social media when everybody's life looks terrific. So be intentional about that and have resilience role models. Everyone has a role model, and most of our role models are people like Churchill, for example. I know someone likes Churchill quite a bit, but in the resilience world, it's most important to have a role model of someone who you know, who you can talk to. And if you put up Rick's picture, that'd be terrific now. This is a picture of Rick Yarosh. He was a soldier of mine who was blown up in a horrific, catastrophic Bradley fighting vehicle attack. He lost one of his legs, his fingers are fused together, burned over 60% of his body. He has no scalp, no ears, very little nose. You see his physical injuries. He is my resilience role model because he told me 5 years after that event that on September 1st, 2006, his life changed for the better. That he sees things in a more positive way now, even with all the challenges he faces, than he's ever felt before. And he's taken that and motivated himself to start a nonprofit. He deals with kids and bullying. So have a resilience role model. It can be anyone from someone you know to someone who you read about, like Admiral Stockdale when he was a POW in Vietnam, or John McCain, but find not just people you want to emulate from a success standpoint, but think of success in many different ways. That there are people out there who have gone through things that can show you the way that you can get through things also. You know, please take that picture down. And the last part about connecting is asking for help. I got better over a period of time because I asked for help. And I think that's important. You can't do everything yourself. I mean, if I had a heart problem, I wouldn't sit at my house and try to figure out how to make my heart better. Or if I had a dental problem, I wouldn't try to dentist myself. So if you have challenges and need counseling, then that's totally acceptable to connect with others in that way. And the last part I'll mention is the triad, I call it my own triad, is take care of yourself. And that goes to eating well. Everybody's heard of the freshman 15 when you go to college as an undergraduate. There's the quarantine 15 now, I've heard mentioned in literature. People are not eating well. They're not being as active. There's eat, sleep, health, and hobbies are the four big components of taking care of yourself. Sleep's important. And I know, Elliot, you've been overseas with some military leaders. Sleep is actually an important, emphasized deal in the military. You can't make good decisions if you're not well rested. So 7 to 9 hours a night is what's expected for a healthy adult to have. And you are more resilient if you are well rested. And it can't just be going to bed whenever you feel tired. It has to be an intentional activity. I'm going to go to bed at this time to get this many hours of sleep. I will say from a health perspective, fitness is important. It's easy to slack off in times like this when you can't go to the gym. I'm guilty of that myself to some degree. And have a hobby. Hobbies actually distract you and take you out of the miserable circumstances that you may think you're in at the moment. There's a book written by a Hungarian American called Flow. And flow really is called the psychology of optimal experience. And basically it's when you're in the zone of something, that when you've kind of forgotten about everything else, you're out there playing golf, or in my case, I play baseball. For those 3 hours in a baseball game, I don't worry about things at work or at home or COVID or anything. I'm in the flow, I'm in the moment and enjoying that in great measure. And that's something that I think taking care of ourselves, that we all have to have. We all have to have some outlet that allows us to be more engaged and more calm. And lastly, I'll say humor is important as part of taking care of yourself. There's nothing that says because you take something very seriously, you can't enjoy life, you can't laugh. And you would be surprised how many people in a military environment have this almost dark sense of humor to help get people through some certain situations. But when you're deployed overseas, the most common thing to do in the evenings or at night or whenever you have some time off is watch movies and watch TV shows to laugh and to laugh with each other. So I think those are my three: is control your thoughts, connect with others, and take care of yourself.
Wow, that was powerful. I'm going to move for a bit to some of the questions, and again, if you want to throw in a question or a comment, please write in the Q&A box. I'll start with a very direct one here from Victor Nakano. Going from the military culture, highly regimented, distinct chain of command, lots of relations, to an academic culture, Hopkins being very decentralized, faculty working independently, few rules. Can you describe your three greatest challenges in working or adapting to the Hopkins culture? I'm tempted to say with special reference to dealing with the dean, but that would probably not be such a good idea.
Three greatest challenges. I think it's not been as difficult as people expect it to be quite honest. I found that if perhaps I was a leader from what I believe to be 50 years ago in the military, and which, the humorous thought was, if I wanted your opinion, I would have given it to you. And there's not a lot of input from a subordinate in the military, but that's not really how the military works nowadays, I don't think. We're very much in tune to the unique situations that soldiers, in my case, find themselves in. I would even go to say that this is an important aspect of resilience when it comes to COVID. I don't think I've had difficulty at Hopkins because I've approached each person I've interacted with as an individual that has uniqueness and unique views and something to contribute. And I think if you believe that about any group of people you interact with, adjusting to different environments is quite a bit easier. Whenever you're a young lieutenant in the Army, you carry around a green notebook, and you're expected to know pretty much everything about the people in your charge, where they're from, do they have sisters, brothers, where their parents are at, do they have a college education, what their certain circumstances are. And I think that type of leadership sentiment is very, very applicable to today for supervisors at Hopkins or any other civilian institution, that it is hard to have a one-size-fits-all leadership model, whether it be at Hopkins or the military or right now in COVID. Everyone has challenges. They're all unique. They're all, and it's incumbent upon the leader to figure out what is special, what is unique about each individual, and tailor your leadership style to that particular person. What works in one case won't work for another. And you can have some insight into what triggers them, what challenges they're facing by knowing things about them. I won't lie and say there's been nothing challenging about going from the military to a civilian culture like this, but I think there's a lot of similarities, and it's not as difficult as people assume it to be, simply because we're trying to move an organization from point A to point B by leveraging the human performance and the human talents and expertise. Clearly, having a little less authoritarianism is a challenge, I guess you could say. Simply saying something or directing something doesn't work quite as well, obviously, and I learned that quite quickly and didn't try to do that. But it's more consensus building. But I don't think the military is absent of that desire. It's just perhaps not as clearly seen.
I'd also say that both the military and the academic world these are mission-driven institutions, which are going to be around for a long time. And I think that does affect the nature of leadership in organizations like this, as say, opposed to something that's more entrepreneurial or that is primarily profit-driven. Let's see, Sandra Panchalingam, have you ever been in a situation where you wanted to give up?
No, I don't think I could say I've ever wanted to give up. There have been some situations where I've been pretty down, and that's, I think, a pretty common sentiment among military leaders, that things just aren't going well. I will say, in 2006 in October, we were suffering. I think in the chat there is an article written about the unit I commanded, and we lost. We had the most casualties of any unit deployed during Ramadan in a particular month, of any of the 60 like-sized units in the Iraqi theater of operations. And it really got to the point of thinking, am I doing a good enough job here? Am I the one failing these guys that are having such difficulty? And we looked at the intelligence, we found what was going on. We were straddling a avenue of advance from Fallujah into Baghdad. And Al-Qaeda had historically bypassed the US military there. But we had actually had some pretty good success going after their operations. So much so that they started to literally come after us and target us. Unfortunately, that also led to people targeting me personally as the commander. I had a personal security detachment, as it's called, a PSD, that whenever a commander of a certain level moves around the battlefield, there's a group of, think of it as a miniature secret service. Wherever I go, they go and they're around me, kind of thing. So if I want to go walking on the street and talk to shop owners, I want to go talk to a sheikh or a tribal leader, they're securing the area and there's always someone kind of right next to me. So we were having success, we were doing well, and Al-Qaeda put out 2 contracts to have me specifically killed by snipers. And unfortunately, 2 of my closest bodyguards, if you will, they're the ones that took the sniper rounds and were killed one morning in October of 2006. That's probably the closest I've ever come to just wondering, am I good enough for this? Am I going to make it? Am I going to get these people back home? Am I the right person for this? And what caused me to kind of tighten up my boots and keep moving forward was I still had 998 people to get home. I had a lot of people relying on me to be confident, good at what I was doing, and making the best decisions possible. And I kind of threw myself into the idea that the US military has been around for 225 years or so at that point. And they've selected me, they've trained me for 17 years to be at the point I am now. I may have some lack of confidence in myself, but I am actually trained to do this. And I have a responsibility, and I love these people here I'm with, and I've got to just put my own personal sadness aside and get us all back home as best I can. So losing a couple people right there next to me whose lives were taken in my place, in essence, was about as close as I've gotten to feeling like giving up.
Wow. I apropos of that, I remember you once saying that it was a common saying, well, I'll deal with that when I get back, about something really adverse, and that you realize that actually doesn't work.
Right.
Could you just maybe expand a little bit on that? Because I think that speaks really to that moment of command in Baghdad, when you must have been suffering a lot of accumulating a lot of physical injury as well.
Sure. The military has grown a lot over the years and changed our perspectives on a lot of things. But I do think that it's kind of beaten into your head at a young age as a young leader, especially a combat arms leader, that you're indestructible. You're impervious to feelings. You can do anything. You're a robot. You're an automaton. And you can just continue on, even in the most harsh and terrible of circumstances. That goes pretty well for a few years, but then you start to question that. And then you get to the point you're a battalion commander and you realize that I have probably 15 years of pent up, undealt with baggage now that I've never dealt with. And especially during a time in the mid 2000s where over a 5 year period, I was deployed at least 6 months of every year for 5 years straight. So going to Iraq, come back for 6 months, go to Afghanistan, back for 4 months, back to Iraq for 7 months. So 5 years, I was gone more than I wasn't. And the idea of accumulated baggage is very real to a commander who's gone through that, and not just commanders, to anyone who's gone through those kinds of circumstances. Our Vice Dean of Academic Affairs, we were talking about this the other day, he used a phrase that I actually hadn't considered to be exactly right, but I think it is actually perfectly descriptive of the kind of sentiment. It's like you put it on the credit card, like I'll pay for that later, I'll deal with that later. And but in the end, when the bill comes due, it's a lot more because you haven't dealt with it. The interest has accumulated. The emotional baggage has grown because you haven't dealt with it. And that is something that I've learned is not a successful way to deal with trauma, stresses, or challenging circumstances. It's best to deal with it directly and head on. We also find that, to relate it back to the optimism discussion, the optimistic people don't avoid dealing with things directly. They're more likely to engage in that upfront as it happens than delaying it for a month or perhaps even years into the future. It's that they seek help more frequently to deal with those things as well. And that's all borne out in the research. So yes, I think I was a failure at dealing with things as they happened because I felt an obligation to help others get through those things first. And that was more of a concern of mine than my own health and well-being.
So, I mean, again, I'd remind everybody we have the Q&A section open, and you should feel free to throw questions in there. I wanted to pick up on something you talked about, which was seeking help. One of my concerns is, just as I do my virtual visits around this community, is I sometimes encounter people who I think really need to get some assistance, not nothing extraordinary, but need help. And it's kind of hard for a lot of people to, a lot of high performing people. This, by the way, I think another similarity between the academic world and the military world. You have people who are very proud and who have accomplished a lot and will accomplish a great deal. And to say, I need help, that is tough. Could you just talk about that issue?
Sure. The military has removed, for many years, people in the military wouldn't go seek help because it would impact, I believed, our security clearances. Because the questionnaire that you fill out before you go through the interview process says, have you ever sought mental health counseling for any issue you may have faced in the past? And all of us would say yes and never go see someone because we didn't want to jeopardize that particularly important part of our military qualifications. That's finally changed in the mid-2000s, where we've eliminated that question as it was written. So the goal is to allow and encourage people to get the help that they need. I think as leaders, it's really important to promote and model self-care, that we have to humanize ourselves to some degree with those that we lead. That will, if we share our struggles with people, that allows them to share theirs, that gives them license to seek help. One of the things I did as a battalion commander when I came back from that one deployment in 2006, and I've done it in other places, but that one was the most impactful, I think, is that when we all came back, the first formation back, part of the reintegration process was to ensure that everyone had a post-deployment health assessment, which included going to see a counselor who would perhaps identify some immediate issues, some things that were difficult, some more challenging people than others. The first formation back, I stood up in the front and said, we suffered 135 casualties this past year. And there's a lot on my mind that I haven't dealt with yet. So Monday morning, I'll be the first one at 8 o'clock to go see the counselor. And that gives people license to express that they're having trouble as well. If I were to stand up, in my opinion, and say, Yeah, we got to go see the counselor now. My gosh, it's just one of those things that we have to do. Just go get it done and check the box on that particular action. I think that would have sent the message that I didn't value mental health. I didn't value their psychological well-being as much as I should have. So I think acknowledging that challenges do exist, acknowledging that we as leaders have our own difficulties dealing with things, it humanizes us and allows them to seek the help that they also need.
Um, I completely agree with that. Let me ask. We have a question here from Dan McGraw. My mother used to tell me, "Turn defeat into victory." When disappointments or problems occurred. How does that compare with your philosophy of resilience or your approach to it? And I'll add something. I mean, I hope to God that that little girl made it okay. But how would you have dealt with it if she didn't?
Um, honestly, I wonder about what's happened to her often and really don't have a way to know that. But if something had happened to her, I would have gone back and tried to intentionally do what I would call gratitude journaling. What can I find that's good about this? What can I find that will allow me to make another situation better? And I don't know what that would be necessarily, but perhaps as I was working to find to make Sukaina's life better in that particular case, we helped rebuild the school so she could go to school. So if her life happened to be taken, I would perhaps say, yes, this is a horrible thing. But in my pursuit of trying to take care of her, I've also now allowed 50 other children to go to school. So that's a positive outcome that came about because of my focus and trying to make this a very specific and very tangible issue that I could deal with. I agree with Professor McGraw that some things are just that they're massive obstacles. And for those who are fans of Marcus Aurelius and the book Meditations, I think he really focused on and his mindset is one I've taken to be very helpful. There's a book from Ryan Holiday called "The Obstacle Is the Way." That you don't avoid the things that are difficult, you don't avoid the setbacks, but you embrace them in such a way that you learn from it and you grow from it. It's like it's an iceberg. You don't try to sail the boat around the iceberg, but you run over the iceberg, and you accelerate over that and engage it in such a way that will help you. It'll help you be even stronger after you get through that situation.
You know, listen to you. It's striking to me that there are different philosophical elements that come into this approach. I mean, you mentioned Marcus Aurelius. A lot of this is classical Stoicism. What got James Stockdale through extraordinary suffering in a North Vietnamese prison camp was that he had been at Stanford for a year and he took a philosophy course on Epictetus, who's the original Stoic philosopher. And he actually, when he was president of the Naval War College, he would lecture on Epictetus as the thing that got him through. There's a lot of mindfulness, that mindset of gratitude and gratitude journaling and so on. That's deep in the mindfulness literature, which people like John Kabat-Zinn and others really commend that to people. So it's so interesting to me that the military really, in the last decade or two, I think has really glommed on to this in ways that I'm not sure other institutions have. I remember I felt for a lot of my State Department colleagues who were deployed in Iraq, and whereas there was a structure for you in terms of training and then, in processing when you came back, and that didn't really have it. And, they had to work this all out for themselves and frequently as individuals. And that was really tough.
There's one additional thing, if I could add, the idea of maintaining perspective is really important. I think that it is easy to get caught up in seeing the world from one particular way. But if you can detach yourself to a degree and look at it as if you were standing away from yourself, look at a situation from multiple perspectives, almost like find the good parts by seeing things from different ways. And You know, one of the first questions you asked today was, how is it related to the military versus civilian? You'd be surprised how many people actually do that already amongst us. And I'm going to ask them to put up one last thing here from Thomas Ridd. Thomas Ridd is one of our professors here, and he may not even realize he's done it. But this is a tweet he put out 10 days ago, 11 days ago. And it shows his ability to maintain perspective and to find something good in a terrible situation. And this is someone who may or may not be trained in this, but it's natural to some people. Dealing with a pandemic has been hard. It's not the Pollyannish view. Yes, it's hard. It's an accepting of the current situation. But imagine if we didn't have the internet. Imagine if we didn't have social media and online shopping. It could be even worse. So it's not necessarily a way to dismiss the challenges, but it's a different perspective. You step back and say, yeah, this is bad. But there are a couple different things here that could have made it worse. And Thomas has demonstrated both maintaining perspective, seeing things from a different point of view. He's not catastrophizing things, and he's trying to find some goodness, the good stuff, in a negative situation here. So I think you might be surprised as you look around. It's not just people who've been through the training itself, people who have gone through some particular set of courses, but there's a natural inclination in a lot of people to be resilient.
Yeah, I think that's right, and but it does require that people be mindful about it. From Kedar Purohit, and I hope I'm pronouncing everybody's names correctly. Often as a result of one's colleagues' mismanagement, you're at the suffering end. Even when it's not your fault over time, you start doubting yourself, asking if perhaps you were at fault. How do you deal with that kind of situation?
I probably am the most guilty person of this of anyone I've ever encountered. I can probably trace the failure or fault of something to me, no matter how distant it perhaps might be. It's like the inverse of 6 degrees of separation of Kevin Bacon. I can find some reason it's my fault. But I think I think it just comes down to being balanced and knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are. Some people have a strength of knowing what's their responsibility, what their fault is, their cause. And some people don't. I have a weakness to catastrophize and to make things my fault. And when I start to feel that other people aren't doing their job, aren't completing what I think they should be doing, I take it upon myself that I should have done something better. I should have done something different to allow success to be more likely. And I really think it goes back to self-reflection, being self-aware, to know what your tendencies are, what your thinking traps are, and then just being more mindful about how you can deal with that and be, it's like the perspective. Step back and say, all right, objectively, this is not my fault. Objectively, I should not have been responsible for this, but I can help in this particular case. And I think knowing our colleagues is an important element of group resilience. There's individual resilience and there's group resilience as well. And that's part of the connection part of the triad that I talk about sometimes. It's important that we know when others of us are struggling in some way. And if they're not doing their job particularly well, or they're not meeting their obligations, then there's a chance for us to reach out to them and say, all right, what's going on here? Is there something else happening that I can help you with? And I think that will increase the bonds and fellowship among people who are working together, as opposed to just pointing out errors and faults in each other.
Yeah. And I think also often, it's easy to assume the worst. Either somebody's not doing their job, or they're lazy, or they're ill-informed, when there may be all kinds of other things going on. And that simple act of just saying, what's on your mind or what's going on can open up all kinds of things. I guess I'll let's see, there's so many good questions here. So I suppose one question that, last question that I'll ask is whether optimism can become counterproductive. That's Tom Parker is asking that question. Can it be counterproductive both on a micro level, but in a kind of a broader policy context. And how do you prevent that from happening?
I think from a policy or a military perspective, optimism is important because it shows the future state that you want to see. But it doesn't negate the importance of planning for alternatives, planning for branches and sequels. For example, one of the things that I found challenging as a military leader to be resilient is we are trained to think of the worst possible case. That leads to one's tendency to catastrophize things in the future. When you see a set of conditions, we are taught to think about how bad it can go. What's the worst thing that can happen here? When you address an enemy course of action, you find the most likely course of action, and then you identify the most dangerous course of action, the worst thing that can happen. So optimism is important that it helps you set a future state that you want to see come into being, but that doesn't negate the importance and the requirement to identify all the bad things that can happen as well. And then you can identify those bad things and try to figure out how to employ a set of tactics or strategies to move that negative outcome back towards the optimistic view of the future that you want to achieve. So I understand the point that it's possible for some to overlook the negative aspects or the negative outcomes, but I don't think those are incompatible ideas.
Well, listen, I'm afraid we're at the end of our time. I just want to say how deeply grateful I am, Craig, that you're willing to give this talk. I think this is a time when all of us need resilience. All of us can get better at it. I also just want to say how fortunate I think SAIS is that we have you here as such an extraordinarily capable leader. And I would finally say that, for members of the SAIS community, and I do this without asking your permission, but I don't think I really have to, knowing you. If this is something that there's something here that people would like to discuss with you, they should reach out to you. I mean, you are a great leader, and you have a lot to teach. And a lot of what we teach at SAIS goes well beyond the stuff that goes on in the classroom. So let me thank you again, and I think we'll bring things to a close here.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Of course.